As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left. Cause I've been blasting and laughing so long that even my mama thinks that my mind is gone. But I ain't never crossed a man that didn't deserve it. Me be treated like a punk, you know that's unheard of. You better watch how you're talking and where you're walking, or you and your homies might be lying in chalk. I really hate the trip, but I gotta low. As they croak, I see myself in the pistol smoke. Fool, I'm the kind of G the little homies wanna be like, on my knees in the night, saying prayers in the street light. Been spending most of their lives living in a gangster's paradise. We've been spending most of their lives living in a gangster's paradise.
Historian Leo Katcher described him as the J.P. Morgan of the underworld, its banker and master of strategy. Meyer Lansky, one of the movers and shakers of the burgeoning national crime syndicate, and who displayed brilliance and cunning himself, observed, he had the most remarkable brain. He understood business instinctively, and I am sure that if he had been a legitimate financier, he would have been just as rich as he became with his gambling and the other rackets he ran. During the first part of the 20th century, and up until his death in 1928, the kingpin of the New York Jewish underworld was not a street-tough gangster, but a refined gambler. His name was Arnold Rothstein. He was recognized by many, including Italian and Irish gangsters, as the pioneer big businessman of organized crime in the United States. For 20 years, the name Arnold Rothstein symbolized big-time gambling and big-time money. Residents in the Jewish community greeted him as AR, but his business partners and allies referred to him as Mr. Big or Big A. These titles pleased Rothstein, who prided himself in the fact that he was never indicted for the many crimes in which he was involved. His secret? He never became too closely involved in a racket. He had a hands-off policy, usually fronting the money for a scheme. Rothstein's price for being the money man, the financial backer, was 90% of the take. He worked on a handshake, and if the individual who ran the scheme didn't pay up, Big A had an army of well-paid ruffians, thumbbreakers and gunmen who protected his interest. It was the Roaring Twenties and the advent of Prohibition. Rothstein financially backed several New York gangsters, giving them their start in the big leagues of the underworld. These included Jack Legs Diamond, Waxy Gordon, and Oni the Killer Madden. He also helped launch the careers of Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Jacob Little Augie Orgen, and the future rising star of the syndicate's Murder Incorporated, Louis Lepke Buchalter. These were the front men, but AR was the brains, always lurking in the background. Ironically, his father was a successful merchant who had an impeccable reputation in his business dealings, so much so that he earned the nickname Rothstein the Just. But Big A, well, he went in the other direction. He knew numbers and was considered by most to be a mathematical genius. He would bet on anything if the odds were in his favor, and he could calculate those odds faster than a modern-day computer. During the second decade of the 20th century, Big A was moving on up. He relocated into New York's entertainment and red light district known as the Tenderloin in the heart of Manhattan. He opened a posh gambling den, gleaning more than $10,000 a week in profits. That's close to $200,000 in today's money. As the decade rolled on, Rothstein was a multi-millionaire, owning numerous nightclubs, gambling resorts, and brothels. In 1919, his fame grew to behemoth levels. Rothstein, through a middleman of course named Abe Attell, a one-time Bantam boxing weight champion, paid 8 Chicago White Sox players to throw the World Series in what has infamously become known as the Chicago Black Sox scandal. Though called to testify in Chicago the next year, Rothstein took the posture of a businessman wrongfully accused. While on the stand, he chastised the grand jury and the city for treating him like a criminal, saying, "Gentlemen, what kind of courtesy is this? What kind of city is this? I came here voluntarily, and what happens? A gang of thugs bar my path with cameras as though I was a notorious person, a criminal even. The grand jury hung its head in shame, and the tongue lashing seemed to work. Big Al was never indicted. Rothstein was always looking for another way to invest the millions of dollars he had gained illegally. So he went into the drug business with Charles Lucky Luciano, a young man he considered to be the brightest of the bright. When the unstable beer baron Dutch Schultz attempted to move in on Jack Diamond's operation, an operation that Mr. Big financially backed, he had his squad of goons kill the Dutchman's best soldiers, and Schultz backed off. He had so much influence in New York's underworld that he was called on to help mediate gang wars between all types of factions, and by this earned another nickname, the Judge. His charge for these services was extremely high. An insider once reported that Rothstein, after settling a turf war, handed the two gang lords an invoice for $500,000. And they paid it out of respect for the man who saved them time and loss of revenue. J. Robert Nash writes, he always carried no less than $200,000 in fresh, crisp $1,000 bills. Behind him, protecting AR against anyone foolish enough as to rob him, were several well-armed bodyguards. Rothstein became so rich that he couldn't invest his money fast enough. So he began lending money to politicians, police captains, judges, government officials, anyone who had a position of authority. And Rothstein didn't care if they never paid it back. They could work off what they owed him in other ways, with favors. If any of his men had been convicted and sent to prison, he would call on a judge or a politician who owed him money, and the would-be convict would find himself back on the street. In other instances, AR could get indictments quashed and charges against his men dismissed. By 1928, Arnold Rothstein was 46 years old and owned Broadway as well as most of the city. But then something strange happened to the man who had the Midas touch. All of a sudden, he couldn't win. He couldn't win at anything. He lost hundreds of thousands of dollars at the racetrack, and his businesses started losing money as well. In September of 1928, Rothstein was involved in a high-stakes poker game in which he lost an estimated $320,000. Believing the game to be fixed, he refused to pay. This sent shockwaves throughout the underworld in both the city and the country. Tongues were wagging, and folks were heard whispering, Arnold Rothstein is welshing on a bet. During the next 2 months, AR continued to lose, and lose big. The presidential election was just around the corner, and Rothstein put $500,000 on Herbert Hoover to win. On Election Day, November 4th, 1928, AR received a call to meet George McManus in room 349 of the Park Sheraton Hotel. McManus was one of the men he had stiffed months earlier in the poker game. At the time he had received the call, Rothstein was hanging out at Lindy's, one of his favorite places, on the corner of East 44th and Broadway. What was said to him in that phone call? Why did he rush out of Lindy's making a beeline for the hotel? No one will ever know. But around 10:15 p.m., Rothstein stumbled out of the service elevator, clutching his stomach. He had been shot at close range. He made it to the sidewalk and then collapsed. As he clung on to life, police came to the hospital and begged Big Al to tell them who shot him. But Rothstein put his finger to his lips, the sign of Omerta, and he refused to tell the police anything. 2 days later, November 6, 1928, Mr. Big Al Rothstein, king of the Roaring Twenties, died of his injuries, never knowing on his last bet he picked right. Herbert Hoover was the president-elect. Rothstein was buried at Ridgewood's Union Field Cemetery in an Orthodox Jewish ceremony. George McManus was arrested and tried for the murder, but was acquitted of all charges. And though Rothstein was worth millions, the money was never found. 10 years after his death, and countless hours searching for Big A's holdings, his brother finally declared the Rothstein estate bankrupt.
Mr. Rothstein, Charlie Luciano to see you.
We got a special guest. Frankie Yale, how are you?
Hey,
I understand you just got back from Chicago.
that's why you brung me here?
I asked him to, Frankie.
I was visiting a friend. So what? It was a lousy visit, though. Huh? For your friend, I mean.
Help yourself. There was a man once. I don't recall his name. Frequented the billiard parlors downtown. He made a comfortable living wagering whether he could swallow certain objects, billiard balls being his specialty. He'd pick a ball, take it down his gullet to here, and regurgitate it back up. And one evening, I decided to challenge this man to a wager. 10,000 in cash for him to do the trick with a billiard ball of my choosing. Now, he knew I'd seen him do this a dozen times, so I can only surmise that he thought I was stupid. We laid down the cash, and I handed him the cue ball. He swallowed it down. It lodged in his throat, and he choked to death on the spot. What I knew and he didn't was that the cue ball was 1/16 of an inch larger than the other balls, just too large to swallow. Do you know what the moral of this tale is, Mr. Yale?
Don't eat a cue ball.
The moral of this story is that if I'd cause a stranger to choke to death for my own amusement, what do you think I'll do to you if you don't tell me who ordered you to kill Colosimo?